Hey everyone, this is a piece by Regina Roth, or Regina Roth. Let's see how you pronounce this name actually in German. Um,
Regina Roth.
oh, it's Regina. Fun. All right.
Regina Roth.
Okay, Regina Roth. Here we go. The piece is titled "The Author Marx and His Editor Engels: Different Views on Volume 3 of Capital." The conference, Marxism 2000, aimed at exploring new insights into the nature of society, economics, and politics by recalling Marxian and Marxist views on these subjects. In this paper, I would like to go back to Marx and the development of Marx's ideas throughout his life. An excellent starting point for such a study is the complete edition of his works, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe Mega, which contains all Marx's drafts, manuscripts, notes, and letters, not merely a selection of them. From these documents, the process by which Marx elaborated his thoughts may be explored, particularly regarding changes in subject, matter, method, or focus throughout his intellectual development. Another important aspect of Marx's work reflected distinctly in the Mega is Marx's close collaboration with Friedrich Engels. Beginning in the 1840s, this collaboration continued not only throughout Marx's lifetime, but after Marx's death as well. In this paper, I shall emphasize this second aspect, which is the work that Marx and Engels did together. There are two main interpretations to consider: the more commonly held view that Marx and Engels are regarded as a singular entity, and the school that stresses the differences between them. See Rigby 1992, also Carver 1996. But as Terrell Carver has recently pointed out, both approaches, quote, are simply artifacts of history, end quote. I would like to take up Terrell Carver's proposal and reevaluate the, quote, considerable and varying dialogues, end quote, between Marx and Engels by examining a concrete case of their working together, Capital Volume 3. As is commonly known, this book was edited by Engels from Marx's papers. When reviewing the contributions that Engels made to Capital Volume 3, it is not to be implied that the, quote, true, end quote, Marx was completed or distorted by Engels, since in my view neither a, quote, right Marx nor a, quote, wrong Engels ever existed. Rather, I propose an approach that concentrates upon the interpretation that Engels gave of Marx's manuscripts, an interpretation, I suggest, that deserves serious consideration. New section: Joint collaboration between Marx and Engels. Perhaps the most important fact about their close cooperation was that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels shared similar basic views. Engels reported in October 1885 that as early as 1845, in Paris, Marx and Engels had confirmed their complete agreement about all theoretical issues, and their collaboration dated from that point in time. Also of great influence was their view of themselves as a team, and both of them deliberately and voluntarily opted for this mutually beneficial cooperation, which would last for more than 40 years. This cooperation occurred mainly in two areas: political activities and their written works. Taking a closer look at the combined written works of Marx and Engels, we may distinguish several levels of mutual cooperation in their composition. Footnote: thanks to Richard Sperl, without whom the following enumerations could not have been outlined. I think it's probably Richard Sperl, and I think Richard Sperl is a mega editor. Back to the text and footnote. Discussions. Marx and Engels had intense discussions both in writing and in person regarding theoretical questions and the actual subject matters they were working on. Joint editing of journals. Even though Marx was the chief editor and spirit behind the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, New Rhine Times, this work would not have appeared on an ongoing basis without the support of Engels. This had to do not only with his commitment to questions of organization, but mostly with his ability to manage the everyday tasks of running a newspaper. Footnote: I would like to thank Francois Melis for detailed information on this topic. One second. End footnote. Joint efforts. To date, the editors of the Megget have identified 12 longer treatises, 30 shorter pieces, and more than 60 articles written for the press that Marx and Engels collaborated on. In some cases, they composed pieces together. This particularly applies to programs, statutes, resolutions, or articles written for the press. Parenthesis, for instance, the New York Tribune, in parenthesis. And the same is true for contributions to the New American Encyclopedia. This is also one longer piece. There is also one longer piece, The German Ideology, which came into being in this way. For some parts of this treatise, Marx and Engels were even supported by a third author, Moses Hess. See Sperl, 2001. In other cases, they divided the subjects between themselves, with each writing from his own perspective, and many texts are frequently discussed in depth between them. Sometimes only one of them completed the final piece. The most notable example of this is the Holy Family. In the case of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, it is controversial as to how exactly Marx and Engels cooperated, because there is barely one page left from the supposed different drafts. However, the fact that they worked together and at least discussed several drafts intensively is generally agreed upon. See Kaczynski, 1995, and Sperl, 2001. Proofreading of pieces that were going to be published, publicity for articles and other written pieces, the exchange of editorial roles between Marx and Engels. Most widely known are Engels' activities in spreading their ideas by publishing new or revised editions of their works, in particular after the death of Marx. There are, however, also some cases where Marx participated in editing works of Engels. For example, Marx wrote the preface to the French edition of Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, published in... Never mind. I guess it's published in the Mega in 1989. There were also several plans for an edition of former works, for instance, the articles in the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. See Rohan, 1998. An example, Capital Volume 1, new section. Engels' contributions were crucial in making it possible for this volume of Marx to be published. However, these contributions mainly had to do with organizational, editorial, and somewhat, quote, practical, end quote, matters, which merely served to elaborate on Marx's perspectives and theories. The correspondence that took place between Marx and Engels regarding Capital Volume 1 is the most important source that illustrates Marx and Engels' cooperation, although there are two reservations to consider. First, Marx and Engels also had several personal meetings, often for 3 or 4 weeks a year. The only exception here was in 1863, when they did not meet at all. See Draper, 1985. Yet there are hardly any records as to the discussions which took place, and we can only speculate as to the topics discussed. Second, we can only judge from the letters that have survived, and therefore quantitative statements as presented below may only serve as a valuable indicator that must be supported by other evidence. Examining that correspondence, we find that on the one hand, Engels was rather well informed as to whether Marx was at work or not, and when Marx wanted to talk about the state of his opus, he mostly turned to Engels. Marx expressed his hopes or talked about obstacles to the progress of his work. See the letter from Marx to Engels, 10th of June, 1861, 27th of May, 1862, 29th of May, 1863, 31st of August, 1864, 31st of July, 1865, 13th of February, 1866, in parentheses. Besides, persons such as Ludwig Kugelmann now and then got some information on the state of his work, parentheses, Marx to Kugelmann, 29th of November, 1864, in parentheses. On the other hand, these communications were limited. There are only a few letters which document the theoretical discussions or debates between Marx and Engels about substantial topics in, quote, the book, end quote. So far as we know, there is only one such letter to be found from 1863, parentheses, Marx to Engels, 6th of July, 1863, end parentheses, and it appears that in 1864 and 1865 no such letters were written at all. In 1867 and 1868 there are more to be found, but not too many. 1867, Marx to Engels, 26th of June, Marx to Engels, 27th of June, and 24th of August. 1868, Marx to Engels, 8th of January, 22nd and 24th of April, 10th of October. Engels to Marx, 6th of May and 24th of June, in parentheses. The few letters to have come down to us hardly depict an ongoing exchange of ideas regarding the theories being constructed. Rather, they reflect the achievements and results Marx himself had obtained. For example, when Marx was deeply involved in the writing of additional drafts of books 2 and 3, he rarely wrote any letters dealing with theoretical considerations. The same had been true when Marx had been writing the manuscript containing the part later known as Theories of Surplus Value in 1861 to 63. Moreover, Engels himself admitted his lack of knowledge. Several letters from 1883 and 1885 quoted above. Besides, the bulk of the correspondence concerning Volume 1 is dedicated to questions that have to do with, quote, practical, end quote, information. Marx had questions regarding the operations of industrial enterprises, or Marx sought material on actual developments in the cotton trade for which Engels was able to offer insider information. Marx often needed this information for illustrations and examples or in order to, quote, prove, end quote, one of his ideas. See, for instance, Marx to Engels, 11th of January, 1860, 6th of March, 1862, 24th and 28th of January, 1863, and 20th of November, 1865. Marx also asked Engels for help in obtaining books. For example, Marx to Engels, 17th of December, 1866. End footnote. This changed to some extent after Marx had finished his first volume. Regarding two factors, the proofreading of the final version and the promotion of the then published volume, Engels actually took up the very important task of proofreading the printed pages of Capital Volume 1, looking for misprints and making stylistic proposals. The criticisms Engels put forward mostly dealt with the presentation as opposed to the content, and it was Engels' suggestion to support the structure by using more subdivisions in the chapter on value, as well as in the chapter on the production of relative surplus value. Engels to Marx, 16th of June, 23rd of August, 1867. Many of his recommendations, however, could not be implemented until the second edition. Marx to Engels, 24th of August, 1867. Although it is true that Marx hoped for a second edition shortly after the publication of the first, Marx to Engels, 16th of June, 1868, this demonstrates that Engels' suggestions were not able to affect the substance of Marx's theories. Thus, Engels' contributions were primarily editorial. One of the main points of their correspondence concerned the publication and distribution of the book. Marx informed Engels about his negotiations with different publishers and asked him for advice. After Capital Volume 1 had eventually appeared, most of the Fetters focused on, to use modern terms, public relations. Discussions were held as to who should best write reviews, where and how to place them. Between October 1867 and January 1868, the very intensive exchange of letters mainly focused on this subject. See Marx to Engels, 22nd of November, 1867, Engels to Marx, 6th of January, 1868, Marx to Engels, 23rd of May, 1868, end parentheses. They also exchanged Come on, I lost my spot. They also exchanged letters about who should translate the book into English. Engels to Marx, 24th of June, 1867. Marx to Engels, 27th of June, 1867. End parenthesis. Aside from this, Engels often tried to motivate or urge Marx to finish his book. Engels to Marx, 31st of January, 1860. 20th of May, 1863. 5th of February, 1865. End parenthesis. In August 1865, for instance, Engels expressed his concern thus, quote, I had really begun to suspect from one or two phrases in your last letter that you had again reached an unexpected turning point which might prolong everything indefinitely, end quote. Engels to Marx, 7th of August, 1865, in parentheses. Lastly, there was Engels' financial support of Marx and Marx's family, without which, as Marx himself freely admitted, Marx would never have been able to get his entire manuscript written, let alone ever have the first volume printed. Marx to Engels, 7th of May, 1867, in parentheses. New section, the author and the editor. The case of Capital, Volume 3. When we study the thoughts of Marx based on his texts, We always have to take into account that these books or pamphlets were, for the most part, not published by Marx himself. One of the few that he did publish was Capital Volume 1, first edition, which appeared in 1867. Marx prepared the second edition in 1872, and the French translation between 1872 and 1875. Marx only began to work on the third edition and an English translation in the 1880s, which had to be completed by Engels, who also finished the fourth edition of Volume 1. Thus, when examining the greater part of Marx's oeuvre, we must refer to editions issued by people other than Marx. That applies above all to the numerous manuscripts and drafts of his economic project. Drafts of books 2 and 3 of Capital are usually only available in the edition Engels prepared and published in 1885 as Capital Volume 2 and in 1894 as Capital Volume 3. Some of the earlier manuscripts were edited in the 20th century, for instance the so-called Grundrisse of 1857-58. These manuscripts first appeared in 1939-41, but were disseminated more widely only in 1953, when the Moscow edition was reprinted in Berlin. Parenthesis, Marx 1973. For a translation on the basis of the Mega edition, see Marx 1986 and 1987 in parenthesis. The same applied to the theories of surplus value, parenthesis 1861 to 1863, in parenthesis. The 10 notebooks containing them are presented together with 13 other notebooks, which together make up the manuscript of 1861 to 63. This is considered to be a draft for all 4 of the books that Marx planned for Capital. See Marx 1976 to 82, that is Mega 2, Volume 2, 3.1 to 6. Which have recently been published in English on the basis of this mega edition in Collected Works, Volume 30 to 4. See Marx 1988 to 94. Earlier translations were based on the selected edition brought out by Karl Kautsky in 1905 to 1910. End footnote. Aside from this, there are generally unknown papers that have only recently been published in the Mega. For instance, the drafts of Book 2 and 3, as well as parts of Book 1 written in 1864/65, have just appeared, parenthesis, Marx, 1988, 1992, in parenthesis, and all the manuscripts dedicated to Capital, which were written after 1867, are in the process of being edited and will be published in the future in the Mega. I begin my analysis of Volume 3 of Capital by looking at these hitherto unpublished manuscripts to get an idea of the themes that the author Marx investigated, the problems Marx envisaged, and the ways Marx attempted to cope with these issues. The interpretation offered here are the views of a modern editor of these manuscripts and are bound to be contrasted with those of Engels. New section, the view of the author. There are a lot of papers related to Capital. First, there are several manuscripts about Book 2, which originated from 1864-65, 1867-68, and 1877 to 1881, as well as manuscripts for Book 3, which dated from 1864, 1865, and 1867 to 1875. Footnote. For manuscripts regarding Book 2 of 1864-65, see Marx, parenthesis, 1988, in parenthesis, that is, Mega 2. The manuscripts of 1867-68 are going to be published in Mega 2 in Volume 2, 4.3, and those of the late years in Mega 2, Volume 2/11. For the manuscripts regarding Book 3, see the following enumeration, end footnote. With regard to Book 3, Marx devoted a great deal of time and pages to discussing the rate of profit, and in particular the relationship between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value. Apart from the main draft of Book 3, these other documents make up the bulk of the text that Marx left regarding this book. Footnote. In the 1870s, Marx did not write many manuscripts at all. Besides the papers on the rate of profit, there were only a few short pieces about rent, interest, and turnover of capital. Parenthesis, Russian Governmental Archive for Social and Political History, and International Institute of Social History, Marx Engels Collection B105, A72, end footnote. More than 200 pages were written in a time span over 10 years. These texts present Marx's work at different levels. There are several versions of introductory paragraphs to chapters, as well as short sketches and longer treatises without direct reference to a section or a chapter in the book, and there were even some notes in books and notebooks. Yet the most important manuscripts are the following. Manuscript of 1864-65. The only draft of Book 3 was written in 1864-65, before Marx put the finishing touches on Capital Volume 1. Engels called the draft of Book 3 the, quote, main manuscript, end quote, or, quote, manuscript 1, end quote. It has already been published in Mega in 1992. The manuscripts of 1867-68. After having published the first volume of Capital, Marx set up a folder he called, quote, belonging to Book 3, end quote, besides another folder, quote, belonging to Book 2, end quote. In 1867-68, Marx put together different papers of varying lengths and identical themes as problems to be worked through in Book 3, especially about the, quote, laws of the rate of profit, end quote. They will be published in Mega in Volume 2, 4.3. Manuscripts of May 1875. In May 1875, after finishing the French translation of Capital Volume 1, Marx started filling over 130 pages of a notebook with reflections on the rate of profit. Marx did not give it a title, but only dated it, quote, begun 20th of May, 1875, end quote. Later, Engels labeled it, quote, rate of surplus value and the rate of profit treated mathematically, end quote. Located in the International Institute for Social History in Marx Engels Collection A77, parenthesis. End parenthesis. It will be published in Mega as Volume 2, 14. Apart from these manuscripts, many papers refer to other issues that are dealt with in the third book, parenthesis, history of money, forms of money, credit, bank, landed property, rent in Russia and in the United States, in parenthesis. And there are also a lot of excerpts that relate to completely different subjects, parenthesis, geology, chemistry, physics, history, end parenthesis. Footnote. All these studies of books, blue books, statistics, pamphlets, and so on will be published in the fourth section of the Mega, presenting excerpts, notices, and annotations. The excerpts on chemistry, for instance, appeared in 1999, parenthesis, Marx and Engels, 1999, end parenthesis, end footnote. In the argument that follows, I concentrate on those papers that deal with the relationship between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, which make up most of the surviving manuscripts written for Book 3, after the publication of Capital Volume 1. In all these papers, Marx tried to clarify the relationship between either profit and surplus value, or between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value. Marx's objective was to show the factors that determine the rate of profit, and thereby to deduce the laws governing the movements of the rate of profit. One of the conclusions that these papers justify is that none of these texts gives a systematic and concise interpretation of Marx's thought. Marx did not decide which of his various ways of treating the issues was the, quote, right, end quote, one. Therefore, a, quote, authorized version, end quote, in terms of an editor does not really exist. There are merely fragments available. I want to point out three distinctive characteristics of the two main texts, which are the first 70 pages of the draft of Book 3 and the manuscript of May 1875. First, from time to time, Marx added some reflections in square brackets to his arguments. Most of these are reminders about thoughts that still waited to be addressed in detail and refer to the contents as well as to the method and structure of the work. Frequently, Marx simply noted an idea, while on other occasions, Marx developed them in greater detail. Other citations reveal that he was still undecided on specific issues. Parenthesis, for example, see Folgraff and Youngnickel, 1994, pages 24 to 7, end parenthesis. For instance, in Marx's draft of 1864-65, Marx noted, quote, in the last stage of editing this narrative, only that which is rational has to be utilized. Of course, for investigation it is necessary to go into detail, but surely not for the reader, end quote. Marx, 1864-65. Parenthesis, published in Mega 1992, 83, my translation. In parentheses. These annotations show that these manuscripts are merely rough drafts. Second, both in 1864 and 1875, Marx failed to discuss systematically the factors that determine the rate of profit. Marx continued to speculate upon what effect the variation of one or another factor would reciprocally have, yet none of these satisfied Marx. Even after formulating sentences that he called, quote, laws, Marx did not come to a conclusion but started all over again. Marx first summarized his considerations on the rate of profit in 9 points. Although Marx labeled the whole of them, quote, law, end quote, he produced 5, quote, main laws, end quote, from them. Following that, Marx tried, quote, to derive the laws not from the difference, but directly from the rate of surplus value and the rate of profit, end quote. Parenthesis, 27, my translation, end parenthesis. A similar tendency is to be found in the manuscripts of 1875. Parenthesis, International Institute for Social History, Marx Engels Collection A77, 2, 40, 112, in parentheses. It seems to be clear that Marx not only needed these repetitions to clarify for himself the strategy of possible solutions, but also the ends he was pursuing. A major obstacle was the mixing of different levels of investigation. To begin with, there are 3 variable magnitudes to analyze: surplus value, variable capital, and constant capital, from which 2 other factors are derived: the rate of surplus value and the composition of capital. All these may have an influence on the rate of profit and may occur in a variety of combinations, and it is difficult to analyze the interconnection by using only examples of different numbers. In addition, some of these factors depend on each other, so that the variation of one cannot be examined without considering the behavior of the other. Finally, it is not enough to simply consider these variations mathematically. One must also take their economic significance into account. Third, to compare different stages of variable magnitudes is one of the major methods Marx used in his analysis, particularly in his paper of 1875. To explain such changes of magnitude, Marx needed different symbols and formulas, and therefore he used a variety of notations to identify a transformation of magnitude in order to distinguish it from the original one. Yet Marx often altered the method of distinction, so these changes in notation reveal that Marx had not yet found a concise way to describe a solution to his problem. Footnote: Sometimes Marx used a subscript or an apostrophe to denote the changed magnitude. In other cases, he wrote German letters instead of Latin letters, parenthesis 1460, and parenthesis, or preferred capital letters to small ones, parenthesis 1, 8, and parenthesis, end footnote. Rather, Marx was still searching for a solution and tried different means to find a solution. Thus, Marx did not leave a, quote, authorized version, end quote, behind. Only fragments have come down to us, and unfortunately, not one of them can offer us a systematic presentation of what Marx thought. New section. The view of the editor. How did Engels cope with this literary estate? To understand the basis from which Engels started, one must ask, what did Engels know about Capital, the book? The relationship I described in earlier portions of this paper was more or less established by the early 1860s. Perhaps there had been more exchange in the years before, especially when Marx decided to publish his first edition of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. In particular, this may be the case because until 1860, Marx and Engels met more often and for longer periods than later on. See Draper, 1985. Yet we have barely any knowledge as to the contents of their discussions. However, after 1867, despite their original joint work, Engels did not get more, but rather less information than he had before in the progress of the outstanding books 2 and 3 of Capital. Apart from certain promises that Marx made in 1867 to complete his work, any discussion of the concrete steps Marx needed to take to make progress on his work does not exist in the correspondence. There only remained questions as to, quote, practical, end quote, matters. Parenthesis, see, for instance, Marx to Engels, 24th of August, 1867, Engels to Marx, 26th and 27th of August, 1867, Marx to Engels, 14th of November, 1868, second letter, see also Photograph, 1996, and Photograph, 2001, in parentheses. Besides, it should be noted that Marx had done the major part of his work on Book 3 by 1865. Marx himself had informed Engels about this accomplishment by warning him, quote, although ready, the manuscript, which in its present form is gigantic, is not fit for publishing for anyone but myself, not even for you, end quote. And that's italicized, so I'm going to read that sentence again. Marx himself had informed Engels about this accomplishment by warning Engels, quote, although ready, the manuscript, which in the manuscript's present form is gigantic, is not fit for publishing for anyone but myself, not even you, end quote. Parenthesis, Marx to Engels, 13th of February, 1866, emphasis added, end parenthesis. It is possible to speculate that they had more discussions after Engels moved closer to Marx in September 1870, but we do not have a record of this being the case. Furthermore, what I find of great significance is that, after the death of Marx, Engels is not sure if manuscripts from the absent volumes were still in existence. His letters from this time demonstrate his state of ignorance. Quote, he, Marx, always concealed the state of his work from us, end quote. Parenthesis, Engels to Peter Lavrov, 2nd of April, 1883, my translation, in parenthesis. See also the letter Engels wrote to August Bebel, 30th of August, 1883. Quote, you ask how it came to be that even I was kept in the dark as to how far along Marx had got with this work. It is quite simple. Had I known, I wouldn't have left him alone at all until it was completely finished and printed, and Marx knew this better than anyone else, end quote. Parenthesis, my translation, end parenthesis. 2 years later, when Engels was dictating Book 3 to Oscar Eisengarten, he wondered, quote, it is almost inconceivable how a man who had such tremendous discoveries, such an entire and complete scientific revolution in his head, could keep it there for 20 years, end quote. Engels to Laura Lafargue, 8th of March, 1885, in parentheses. If you don't know, that's Marx's daughter. Right? Yeah. Where am I? Okay. Yeah. What did I want to look up? Oscar Eisengarten. I've never seen this name before. German Wikipedia says Oscar Eisengarten lived from 1857 to 1906 and was a German typesetter. Oscar Eisengarten was the son of the postal worker Wilhelm Eisengarten, who died on the 20th of January 1866, and his wife Elisabeth Rugge. Excuse me. Oscar Eisengarten was the great uncle of the Nazi resistance fighter and East German writer Hasso Grabner. From around 1879, Eisengarten was a member of the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany and the Leipzig Association for the Further Training of Workers. On the 5th of April, 1882, Oscar Eisengarten protested against his expulsion because he had been denounced by his bride's stepfather, the policeman Gebler. Despite this, the expulsion was renewed on the 25th of April. After that, he's said to have moved to Schkeuditz. Between 1883 and 1884, Oscar Eisengarten emigrated to London due to the socialist laws. Through the mediation of his acquaintance, Wilhelm Liebknecht, Oscar Eisengarten managed to publish an anonymous essay on England's Industrial Reserve Army in the magazine Die Neue Zeit. Eisengarten was temporarily Friedrich Engels' secretary and editorial assistant between June 1884 and February 1885. Oscar Eisengarten prepared the editorial manuscript for Volume 2 of Marx's Capital. The manuscript for the second volume, mostly handwritten by Eisengarten, was used as a printing template by Otto Meissner's publishing house in Hamburg. It documents in detail Friedrich Engels' editorial work on Marx's work after his death, which consisted of Engels, quote, heavily revising the text, the rearrangements, corrections, deletions, and expansions of individual words or entire passages, as well as through the translation of foreign language quotations. End quote. 14 letters from Eisengarten to Engels have survived. Shortly before his death, Eisengarten translated the memoirs of Friedrich Lessner. Eisengarten was buried on the 12th of May, 1906, at Manor Park Cemetery in London. Okay, so that was maybe a little more than we needed to know, but that name hit me. Engels spent many years working on Marx's papers. Actually, hold on, I don't know if I read the last sentence of the last paragraph. Anyway. Also, the intensity with which Engels studied the manuscripts of Marx reveal how little he knew about how far Marx had reached his progress on capital. Engels spent many years working on Marx's papers. During this time, Engels selected various sources and decided which parts Engels would keep in the original form and which Engels wanted to revise. In the preface to Capital, Volume 3, Engels provided the reader with background as to his method of editing Book 3. In relation to the first chapter, Engels pointed out various sources Engels used in composing the final version, acknowledging that there was not much of the manuscript of 1864-65 he could use. Instead, Engels relied on two shorter pieces for the beginning of the book and on a summary from the mathematical notebook that Samuel Moore had prepared for him. International Institute for Social History, Marx Engels Collection, Q14, . Thus, Engels arranged this material in the first 44 pages of his editorialized version of the text. To get an impression of the way that Engels condensed more than 200 pages of Marx, it is worth examining the third chapter, pages 28 to 44. Footnote, that is, pages 170 from the main manuscript, and several page manuscripts on the rate of profit. End footnote. Where am I? Damn it, where's the footnote? Okay, here we go. To get an impression of the way that Engels condensed more than 200 pages of Marx, it is worth examining the third chapter, pages 28 to 44. These reflect the relationship between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, a problem that dominated most of Marx's unfinished papers. Engels opened with a discussion of the magnitudes to be used in the computations and presented some basic assumptions which underlay his analysis, taking over the terms and notation which were to be found in Book 1. After several preliminary remarks, Engels discussed the factors that determine the rate of profit to identify how different combinations of factors produce different results. Engels pointed out two primary factors, one being the rate of surplus value and the other being the ratio between variable capital and total capital advanced. If we compare Engels' compilation of Marx's manuscripts, we find common notation as well as remarkable differences. To begin with the remarkable differences, Engels introduced a systematic discussion about the factors affecting the rate of profit. Engels focused upon two main factors and accordingly discussed potential outcomes. First, Engels treated the rate of surplus value as the constant factor and then the relation between variable and total capital advanced. This systematizing effect can also be seen in the last paragraphs of this chapter, whereas Marx had come up with several more or less general statements. E.g., Marx Engels Collection at the International Institute for Social History, A778, It was Engels who produced the summarizing sentence, which stated clear dependencies. Afterwards, Engels standardized the notation, the formula, and the examples in order to render the different cases comparable. Engels drew upon Samuel Moore, who had advised adherence to a unified notation and provided some suggestions in his written summary of Marx's manuscript from 1875. Engels also adjusted the figures used in his examples. Where Marx handled them with different numbers, Engels had already standardized them in notes he took from Marx's manuscripts. Engels always chose one set of figures. 80 constant capital, 20 variable capital, and 20 surplus value, as Engels' starting point and described his procedure in the published version. International Institute of Social History, Marx Engels Collection, H83, and Marx, Mega, 1998, 55-7, in parentheses. Moreover, Engels wrote introductory paragraphs, parentheses, for instance, the beginning of the third chapter, in parentheses, and provided links to other passages, parentheses, Marx, 1998, pages 57 and 59, in parentheses. Footnote. The classification that, quote, the analysis, therefore, first is carried on purely in the mathematical field, end quote, also stems from Engels, end footnote. Furthermore, there are some topics which Marx only hinted at, but which Engels analyzed in greater detail. Engels produced, for example, a list of several factors that exert an influence on constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value. Although Engels did not discuss them at length, Engels did devote some sentences to them. After having noted them already in the preparatory summary. Indeed, Marx had only mentioned some of them sparingly in his manuscripts. In another case, Engels took up a critical note Marx wrote on Ricardo, explaining it and gave a reference for it. Where am I? Where the hell am I? Sorry, I'm fucking lost here. Indeed, Marx had only mentioned some of them sparingly in his manuscripts. In another case, Engels took up a critical note Marx wrote on Ricardo, explaining it and gave a reference for it. The introductory passage is also based on a phrase of Marx. Widely known is that Engels elaborated the whole of the fourth chapter on the turnover of capital, where Marx had only left a heading. Conversely, there are other passages in which Engels kept Marx's original words without any modification. In particular, Engels adopted Marx's method of discussing the various influences on the rate of profit. He also compared specific cases and examples and did not generalize about them any more than Marx did. In introducing individual chapters, Engels followed Marx's phrases, when possible. This holds for true, for example, for the headings describing specific examples. Marx wrote, quote, let's consider the changes of cost price originating in variable capital, unquote. And Engels reworded that to, quote, says S parenthesis, I don't know, it's weird. S constant capital. I don't fucking know. That's a weird thing. I don't know how this thing. Anyway, it says S emphasis, like how it puts like the rate of surplus value in the actual book. I don't think this is. I think this might be a typo here. I'm not sure. Constant V variable total capital advance changes through the variation of variable capital, end quote. There are other phrases borrowed from Marx, especially in the rather rare case in which Marx expressed his view on the economic meaning of the variation under consideration. This applies above all to statements dealing with variables, general aspects, and summaries. In general, Engels only selected the aspects of Marx's work that made sense to him. Those Engels felt the reader would understand. The more opaque concepts were not included. What is described here is primarily the structure of the first part of Book 3. Fulgraf and Youngnickel, in 1994 and 1995, have developed a detailed categorization of the various forms that Engels employed in dealing with Marx's manuscript to create the printed version of Volume 3, additions, omissions, upgrading, reformulation, and correction of texts and terms. How did Engels comprehend his mission of editing Marx? Engels was not an editor in the contemporary sense of the word. Engels was not someone who simply interested in preparing a complete volume. Rather, Engels had particular motives and interests in undertaking this task. The question of right or wrong is not relevant to the argument, let alone any form of critique as to the importance of Engels' work. Yet it is necessary to ask why Engels presented books 2 and 3 of Capital in the way that Engels chose to, in the same manner that we try to understand Engels' motives regarding other issues, for instance, party politics, Shortly after Marx's death, French and German newspapers reported that Engels would finish Capital. Indeed, the people surrounding Engels expected this as well, August Babel to Engels, 17th of March, 1883. Edward Bernstein to Engels, 15th of March, 1883, Yet Engels himself only affirmed this intention somewhat later, after the manuscripts were discovered. From that moment on, Engels made known that the papers Marx had left were not in finished form. However, to his credit, Engels made an important distinction between content and form. He referred to the content of Book 3 in his outburst of enthusiasm after he read the manuscripts in the spring of 1885, quote, "the most astounding thing I ever read," end quote. Engels to Nikolai Danielson, 23rd of April, 1885, quote, "an entire and complete scientific revolution," end quote. Engels to Laura Lafargue, 8th of March, 1885, quote, "indeed, some quite brilliant things will revolutionize economics," end quote. Engels to Johann Philipp Becker, 2nd of April, 1885, my translation, end parenthesis. Footnote: Engels read the manuscripts while he dictated them to Oscar Eisengarten. Engels had employed Eisengarten as his secretary to ensure that Marx's handwritten manuscripts could be made legible for those other than himself. Dictation of books 2 and 3 took place in 1884/1885. End footnote. In respect to form, most of these commentaries were accompanied by complaints that this work was incomplete. In the preface to Volume 2, Engels confirmed this and acknowledged that Marx's legacy consisted of, quote, "mostly fragmentary texts," end quote, but considered all these pieces to be, quote, a connected and as far as possible complete work," end quote. Engels. When Engels prepared Book 3 for publication, the weight of Engels' perception of the manuscripts underwent changes. In 1894, in the preface to the third volume, Engels alluded to the fact that Marx's work was unfinished, not only in language and form, but in subject matter as well. Engels described parts of the work as being, quote, "sketchy and incomplete," end quote. Engels conceded that, quote, "excursions to, quote, side issues," end quote, made it difficult to follow the arguments, and Engels arrived at somewhat evasive description. Quote, "but the further one went, the longer and more complex the sentences, became, in which thoughts were recorded in statu nascendi," end quote. The hell does that mean? Does that mean like the thoughts were being recorded while they were being come up with? Is that what that means? In statu nascendi is a Latin phrase that translates, quote, "in the state of being born," end quote, or, quote, "in the course of being formed," end quote. So it sounds like I was right, because I'm a genius. In 1895, Engels stated in a letter to Werner Zombart that the work of Marx was no more than a, quote, "first draft," end quote, which posed a lot of questions worthy of discussion, but without answering them. Engels stated that, quote, "Marx's approach was not through a doctrine, but a method. It doesn't offer completed dogmas, but fertile perspectives for further investigation and method, for this investigation, end quote. Engels explicitly invited Zombart and others to provide such, quote, very precious supplements to Capital, end quote, in which they would address these important points which, quote, Marx had not yet developed, end quote. Parenthesis, Engels to Werner Zombart, 11th of March, 1895, my translation, end parenthesis. Indeed, in his text, quote, Law of Value and Rate of Profit, end quote, written in spring 1895, Engels characterized Marx's Capital, Volume 3, merely as a, quote, hastily sketched and partly incomplete first draft, end quote. Engels. In fact, Engels is well aware that any text that did not present, quote, Marx in Marx's own words, end quote, would be an interpretation, a commentary, which would inevitably evoke debates and a request for the, quote, authentic, end quote, text of Marx. By 1885, Engels had informed the reader about his two objectives, to give Marx in Marx's words and to present a comprehensible book. Yet Engels was rather ambitious. He did not simply want to change, quote, the style, only in places where Marx would have changed it himself, end quote. Engels also endeavored to solve all textual ambiguities, quote, exclusively in the spirit of the author, end quote. Later on, in a private letter, Engels expressed his intention more clearly, quote, but as this crowning volume is such a splendid and unanswerable work, I consider myself bound to bring it out in a shape in which the whole line of argument stands forth clearly and in bold relief. Parenthesis. Engels to Nikolai Danielson, 4th of July, 1889, in parenthesis. In his last manuscript, he went into detail confirming that he had intervened to explain difficult passages, to stress important aspects, and to add supplementary evidence. In the preface to Volume 3, he did not explicitly address the question of interpretation, so Engels did not perceive that the modification he inserted in the opening chapters of Volume 3 of Capital could offer conflicts between his two objectives. Thus, we may conclude that Engels did not realize that his manner of compilation was anything more than interpretation. Footnote. In fact, it is not quite clear whether Engels actually did not realize such conflicts or silently accepted that they were meant to occur. End footnote. This outlook is underscored by a statement that Engels had made shortly after the death of Marx, in which he claimed himself to be the theoretical leader of the workers' movement. Engels proposed that in the political world, Engels was not an indispensable person, whereas in theoretical matters he, quote, did not yet see who was in the position to replace myself and Marx, end quote. Parenthesis, Engels to August Bebel, 30th of April, 1883, my translation, end parenthesis. Final section, conclusion. A study of Marx's manuscripts of Book 3 and Engels' edition of them in Volume 3 of Capital not only answers some questions, but raises new problems as well. Surely Engels saw himself as a legitimate person to offer an appropriate interpretation, and he was supported in his belief by the leadership of the Social Democratic Party. The question that should be asked is not whether he succeeded in presenting a suitable portrayal of Marx's ideas, or if he properly understood Marx. This is not a question of whether Engels distorted Marx. Indeed, in preparing Marx's papers for publication, Engels did not function arbitrarily, for there is ample evidence to support the decision he made. Rather, our task is to ask if these decisions were the only possible decisions, if there is not another manner in which Marx may be understood. Therefore, it is necessary for us to analyze the interpretation that Engels passed down to us. The basis for such an analysis will be given by the Mega presenting the authentic texts of Marx and those of Engels. Furthermore, we must thoughtfully consider Engels' sources as well as the development of Engels' own economic insight and awareness. How did Engels elaborate his own thoughts on economics? What exactly did Engels know about what Marx had done? If we reach some degree of clarity as to these points, then we can ask anew about where Engels and Marx shared common ground and where they differed. With regard to Marx, we find that solutions to difficult issues continued to evade him, and that he was constantly wrestling for a language that adequately expressed his ideas. Accordingly, the edition of the manuscripts does not serve to end the debate as to what Marx thought or wanted to say, rather it renews it. And that's the end of the piece. I would like to thank Jürgen Harris, Gerald Hubmann, Norman Levine, and Karl Erich Vollgraff for helpful discussions on these issues, as well as Rory Johnstone, who took care of the English. Of course, our responsibility for interpretations and mistakes rests with me. And the sources are, the references are Terrell Carver's 1996 article, Marx Engels or Marx vs. Engels, published in Mega Studien 1996, pages 79 to 85. And 1999 article, The Marx-Engels Question, Interpretation, Identity/Identities, Partnership Politics in Engels After Marx, edited by M.B. Steger and Terrell Carver. Hal Draper, 1985, The Marx-Engels Chronicle, a day-by-day chronology of Marx and Engels' life and activity. Friedrich Engels, 1990, On the Work of the Communist... Okay, these are just... I'm not going to read the Engels quotes, Engels text. There's some pieces by Young, Nickel, and Vollgraff, 1995, but they're in German. German article by T. Kaczynski. S.H. Rigby's book, Engels and the Formation of Marxism, History, Dialectics, and Revolution. I want to look this up, actually. An article by J. Rohan, 1998. Richard Sperl, article 2001. Karl Erich Vollgraff, 1996. German. And a piece by Vollgraff and Young Nickel, 1994. Thank you so much for listening. Wait, I wanted to look up that book real quick. Engels and the Formation of Marxism. The description for this on Amazon says, although Friedrich Engels was Marx's intellectual partner, Engels has been one of the most neglected of the major socialist thinkers. This major book aims neither to defend Engels nor debunk Engels, but rather to engage with his thought in order to offer a critical assessment of the philosophy, social theory, and politics of Marxism. S.H. Rigby shows how many of the key issues of Marxist thought, such as Marxism's debt to Hegelianism, the nature of historical materialism, and the relationship between class and gender, were most explicitly dealt with by Engels rather than by Marx himself. He examines Engels' contribution to the genesis of Marxism in the years before 1848 and examines the extent to which Engels' later writings departed from his and Marx's outlook of the 1840s. S.H. Rigby asks whether Marx shared Engels' intellectual development, questions recent attempts to divorce the views of Marx from those of Engels, and criticizes those Marxists who have used Engels as a scapegoat in order to avoid a confrontation with problems that lay at the very heart of Marxism. Okay, so that was the description of S.H. Rigby's Engels and the Formation of Marxism, History, Dialectics, and Revolution. Thank you so much for listening.